You're listening to The Flagship. I'm your host, Matt Cuso. Before we dive into today's complex topic, we want to share some quick history on UW Madison and UW System to put today's conversation into context. Founded in 1848, the University of Wisconsin has been the centerpiece of higher education in Wisconsin for more than 150 years. As a state-funded university, the institution's mission was set early and codified by University President Charles Van Hise in 1905 with the introduction of the Wisconsin Idea. The Wisconsin Idea is an articulated commitment for the university to serve every corner of the state. That promise has been delivered upon over and over again through research projects that improved agricultural yields to medical advancements that saved countless lives across the globe. In the early 1970s, all the state universities were consolidated into the current UW system. This process was designed to build efficiencies, but also set the stage for the current struggles facing higher education broadly and UW Madison specifically. Now, 50 years after the start of the creation of UW system, UW Madison stands in a precarious position, tumbling in national rankings and seeing research outputs decline. To put this all in context today is Jason Stein, the research director of the Wisconsin Policy Forum and lead author of the study Falling Behind: The State of Wisconsin's Public Colleges and Universities. Thanks for joining us today, Jason. Jason, spend a moment and tell the audience, what is the Wisconsin Policy Forum?
Sure, absolutely. So the Wisconsin Policy Forum is a nonpartisan group that was created to study state and local policy in Wisconsin. We're pretty new. We were created in 2018. But we were formed by the merger of two very long-standing groups, the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance and the Public Policy Forum of Milwaukee, that each have been around for more than 80 years. So we've been a part of the landscape in Wisconsin for a long time.
You have a history in the state.
That's absolutely right. And we just try and promote a better, more informed discussion. And so, as you'll see later on in this discussion, we don't directly advocate for policies. What we try and do is be good faith brokers and tell policymakers, look, here are the trade-offs for you of anything that you're going to do. Here's the positives, here's the negatives, and we try to not hide the ball on those things.
So today's discussion is about a recent report that you completed called Falling Behind. Tell me a little bit about how this study came to be.
Well, we've been looking at the issue of higher education for a long time, and I think in a lot of ways, as I mentioned earlier, our higher education policy in the state has really been a negative policy in the sense that it's a policy of absence. So in a lot of ways, our higher education funding got decided by, well, what do we have left over after we make all these other decisions on some of these other state priorities? And I think, it's really in this time of the pandemic, really, I think, incumbent on us to start to think about what do we want to accomplish with our higher education policy? What is our positive vision? Not positive in the sense of good or bad, but what is the things that we actually want to accomplish as opposed to what are we left with having to do once we sort of make decisions in completely other areas of state finance and state policy. So, that was there. And then, we had the opportunity to collaborate or at least, take on in a partnership this study with Badgers United. And it was, I hope, something that will be good for the state and further a discussion about a critical priority.
You referenced this trend of UW system sort of falling in the priority list for the public and lawmakers. How long has this been going on?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, really going back to the early 1990s at least. So if you think about state general purpose revenue, which is really just a fancy word for state tax dollars mainly, the UW system has fallen from the second priority to the fifth over those decades. Another way of thinking about it is, as recently as a decade ago, those state tax dollars were the main or the largest single funding source for the UW system and are now the third behind tuition dollars and federal revenues. There's some complicated stuff going on with the federal revenues that doesn't make it an apples to apples comparison. But I think the larger point is valid that the GPR funding has just not kept pace, and that's for the overall system. But UW Madison has historically gotten roughly 40% of that funding. And so the effect on UW Madison has been similar to the effect on the system overall over time.
So the trend started in the 1990s. And if you go back in time, that was right at the end of then Governor Tommy Thompson's term here in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Now he's president of UW system. How does this study affect the decisions that are in front of Governor Thompson, President Thompson? When he was governor, he strongly supported UW system. Now he's president of a system that's gone through at least a decade, maybe 2 decades of less support among our lawmakers. What can he do to turn that around?
I think one of the challenges has been, and he would understand this better than almost anyone, is that so much of what happens to the system is driven by these other things within the state's budget and priorities. So there are things like Medicaid, which is essentially, a state federal healthcare program for the needy, that has been growing very quickly, going back to, the 1990s when it was expanded under Governor Thompson. That has been a major competition for state tax dollars. The state prison system has also provided, some of that competition for state tax dollars. So, I think in some fashion, for higher education, the state has to think about what is this priority worth and how does it find a way to balance that against these other priorities. And on the one hand, the UW system president, it's not really his or her job, right? Because, that's ultimately a decision made by the governor and the legislature. But I think what perhaps Governor Thompson might be able to bring to the table that someone who is purely a creature of the higher ed world cannot is he can, in his discussions with the administration and with lawmakers, speak to this overarching vision of how do you balance these competing priorities and how do policymakers want to think about them? How do they want to think about higher education as compared to prisons or as compared to healthcare or as compared to K-12 schools?
So let's jump into some of those priorities. What were your biggest takeaways from the study?
So, very 35,000-foot view, when you look at the trends for enrollment and financing of higher education through state tax dollars and tuition, the UW system and the technical colleges of the state have seen tougher trends in recent years than their counterparts in most other states.
Elaborate on that.
Sure. And let me just say one other thing. The other thing, and we can unpack all of these things, is that in addition to those things, we have a highly centralized governance system for higher education in Wisconsin that may complicate the response to both the pandemic and to some of these other financial and demographic pressures that we talked about. So you were asking me, though, to elaborate on the enrollment and the financing trends. The enrollment trends are pretty straightforward. When you look over the past decade, we've seen about a 13% drop in enrollment within our higher education system in Wisconsin. That's a little more than double the national trend. So, the enrollment trend is not good anywhere, really, or in general, nationally, it's not good for higher education, but it's worse in Wisconsin and in other upper Midwest states. And that's principally just demographics, that when you look at the numbers of students completing high school, which is your traditional pool for people that are going to college, they just are down. So, if you look at it over a 20-year period, it doesn't look quite as negative as if you look back just 10 years. But, the bottom line is that's an issue. And then again, we talked about, the sort of state tax dollar pressures. And then, what we haven't talked about is in Wisconsin, since 2014, we have frozen in-state undergraduate tuition in most cases within the UW system at 2013 levels.
So it's fair to say that at this point in time, there's a lot of unused capacity at UW system. We have desks that we can fill with students.
Yeah, absolutely. And to some degree, there have obviously been cuts in faculty, on a number of campuses. And in some campuses like UW Madison, there have been modest increases in enrollment.
Sure.
So, but yeah, I think that's correct. And certainly it's the case that, to the extent you have ongoing enrollment declines in some places, that's going to be an ongoing issue. And that's certainly, one of the things that it didn't get as much of the headlines, but that is one of the things that we talked about a little bit in the report.
So we have reduced enrollments. We have a tuition freeze going on 10 years, and we have declining GPR. Are those the three major problems that are facing higher ed in Wisconsin today?
Yeah. I mean, a tuition freeze, at least tuition frozen at 2013 levels. When you look at the challenges from a financial standpoint, the enrollment, the tuition, the state funding, those are the big challenges. I think maybe the other intangible is that education has sometimes become sort of a political football or dividing line in our society. And that's also something that worries me. That's more of an intangible. That's not a fiscal issue. But I think when you look at the sort of stuff that's going to show up on the balance sheet, those are the things that we're talking about. And, an example of how that plays out, which we haven't mentioned, is that campuses can carry balances for tuition dollars. They can't do it for state tax dollars, but they can do it for tuition dollars. And, those have fallen over time. So, when you look at where they were in 2013, there's been a decrease of, I think, about 59% in the tuition balances that the universities of the state are carrying. And some of them are carrying pretty small balances. Some of them have larger balances. But collectively, as a system, those balances are down. Now, why does that matter? Well, when you have, an unexpected negative event, like let's say a global pandemic, those resources are things that you can draw on to meet needs that you didn't know you were going to have. And, certainly that's the situation that our colleges and universities find themselves in.
So clearly those surplus balances were a problem for lawmakers in the last 10 years. I think that really the whole debate about the surpluses was in the year 2013, and it really had led to the tuition freeze.
Yep.
For a period of 10 years. What can lawmakers do to back out of this current situation that they are in right now?
Yeah, I think it's worth going over that history briefly, at least. It was certainly the case that tuition rose very rapidly during the 2000s. And, at the same time, even during the Great Recession, those tuition balances that I just mentioned also continued to rise. When it was certainly possible that they could have been used to moderate tuition increases during the Great Recession at a time when people were hurting. Now, I think at the same time, the universities would probably point to the fact that the tuition increases also didn't come out of nowhere. Those often happened in a context of state funding cuts. And, it often is the case that whether it's a school district or a university or whoever, in response to greater uncertainty, events like the Great Recession, events like state funding cuts, they will sometimes try and build balances as a hedge against that uncertainty. So, in some ways, I think it was both understandable perhaps why, or at least rational in some way, why if you were running a university, you would want to start to try and build up reserves in an environment like that. And also why if you're a lawmaker who's charged with looking after your constituents who have to pay that tuition, why you would be very skeptical of balances like that being built. But, that is the history that we're talking about. The present is that and we can talk about this, tuition increases have really been moderated.
Tuition increases for non-resident students. You're talking the professional schools.
I was saying tuition, right. I'm saying there's been very little in the way of tuition or fee increases for in-state undergraduate students. So, and we can talk about the specifics on that. And the tuition balances have come way down. So, to some degree, sometimes in public life, you end up having the same old debate, even though the facts on the ground have changed. And that might be one of the cases here where just over time, the reality that we live in here, and I guess now it's 2021, is it's a different world than it was in 2013.
So COVID suddenly justifies the creation of the surplus balances a little bit more for people. It puts something real as to why they would need a balance.
Absolutely. I mean, when we, just as an organization, we study the finances of school districts, of cities, of counties, and of state government itself, particularly in the case of any state entity, about, some kinds of cash reserves and balances, which are just, a balance is just assets minus liabilities, and what you're left with is a balance in a fund. Those serve a purpose. Again, particularly in state government, because state government has the kinds of revenues from income, corporate and sales taxes that can tank when you have a downturn. Local governments are a little bit more stable because they have the property tax. So if you're anybody that's sort of connected to state government and you're trying to run a big operation, one of the things that you have to think about is, what do I do if everything in the economy goes south? And, one answer to that question is, well, turn to some reserves that I've built up in better times.
And lawmakers really have taken that very prudent step themselves by creating a rainy day account for the state of Wisconsin, much like the universities created surplus funds to weather those dips in resources.
Yes. I mean, for many, many years in Wisconsin, we skated on really thin ice and we carried very few reserves. And during the Great Recession, we paid, in my view, a great price for it. And I think one of the positive developments in state government over the past decade is that the state itself has built up balances within its general and rainy day funds I think I have said before publicly, thank goodness that we had those.
Right.
We also had a balance in our unemployment fund. Thank goodness that we had it, because when COVID-19 hit us, it really developed in the matter of a couple months. And if we had not had those reserves, everything connected with state government, including the University of Wisconsin system, would be in worse shape.
So I think we've all witnessed the impact of COVID-19 and how it's changed the delivery of basic services in our lives. Talk a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted just UW Madison's campus.
Well, and again, I would not set myself up as an expert on this. I mean, I am certainly not a public health person. I'm not even necessarily a higher ed policy person as much as I am a fiscal person. But certainly it's been the case that, in terms of in-person classes, in terms of the revenues that derive from student housing and food service revenues, the revenues that derive from athletics, you look at all those things, those have been severely impacted by the pandemic. There's been all kinds of public health concerns and spending that has been needed around, testing and PPE and all kinds of things for the university. There has also been, some federal legislation that has helped higher education institutions. But, overall, that has been a big challenge for the university. In late October, UW Madison said it was expecting a $320 million budget impact from March of 2020 to June 2021 due to these increased costs and lower revenues. We have yet to see how those numbers might be affected by this latest round of federal COVID relief legislation. But obviously, I think that speaks to your question. There's been a big impact.
So, Jason, let me paraphrase here for a second. In the state right now, we're looking at flat or declining enrollments,
right?
Flat or declining state investment, and a national pandemic. You're a bundle of good news here in this report. So tell me, how does Wisconsin compare to other states around the country?
Within the higher education system, I mean, I think we talked a little bit about the enrollment challenges, that they're more than the decline over the past decade has been more than double.
What would you attribute to that decline?
I think it's as simple as demographics.
Okay.
Mainly. I mean, one good bit of news is I think that we have been better at keeping our own students and not having them go out of state. And to some degree, perhaps the tuition freeze has been helpful in that regard. But then again, when you look at some of these financing trends, to dial in specifically to the tuition freeze, if you look at a university like UW Madison, their in-state undergraduate tuition and fees have increased about 3% since 2013. When you look at a group of 35 peer universities, public research institutions, that's the third lowest increase over that period of anyone. It's an increase that is obviously well below the rate of inflation for those years. When you look at the other universities in that group that had similar, in a similar fashion held down tuition, the University of Washington-Seattle is a good example where tuition actually fell. That happened because the state legislature essentially put in additional state tax dollars and state funding to buy that tuition down. Whereas at UW Madison, obviously, there was a different phenomenon happening. There was a policy decision to hold down both state tax funding and tuition dollars.
Are you aware of any other state that has had this severe of a tuition freeze in place?
I mean, it's certainly, I want to be careful because I'm not sure that we looked at it in quite that way, but it is certainly among the most restrictive increases in tuition. And again, different states have different policies. So both in Washington and Florida, there was additional funding that was provided, and tuition was either decreased or held very small increase. That's a little different than just a freeze that is happening independent of state funding levels. But I mean, certainly when you look at the overall funding that's available for higher education, Wisconsin has, on a per student basis, full-time equivalent basis, the funding for higher education in Wisconsin has dipped below the national average over this period that we're talking about.
Can you put some numbers to that?
If you look at between 2000 and 2019, when you look at adjusted total revenues from appropriations and tuition and fees on a full-time student basis, they fell from 10% above the national average in 2000 to 9.2% below the national average in 2019. Now, there is one caveat that these numbers that are from a national higher ed organization may not include some property tax revenue for tech colleges that they should. But the downward trend is still the same. And even if you add those in, as we did, you're still below the national average. So, I mean, the trend there is clear. It's one in which Wisconsin has not kept pace on a higher education funding with other states nationally.
Your report also spends a lot of time talking about Wisconsin's unusual structure and governance and how that compares to other states, and for UW Madison in particular, how that compares to their peer group of R1 research institutions across the country. Can you talk a little bit about the structure and governance of Wisconsin and why it's unique in this country and the problems that creates?
Sure, absolutely. And this is something where it's not necessarily objective as like the funding. You can come up with a number, right? And when you talk about governance, it's a little more amorphous, but in general terms, like you look at Wisconsin, UW Madison is part of an overall UW system. There's one statewide governing board, the Board of Regents, for all the institutions.
So for all 13 four-year colleges and all
correct.
13 of the two-year
right.
colleges that are underneath the 4 years now.
Exactly. And also, there's no constitutional authority for the UW system. I mean, it's statutory authority, whereas in some other states, their constitution actually provides some basis for the universities. And so when you look at all those factors, there are not many other public R1 research institutions like UW Madison that are governed that way. And so, I mean, there's certainly
controlled that way.
Correct.
So you're saying the other R1s, the other top research institutions around the country, just have more autonomy?
Typically, they do. And I mean, I think a good example would be our neighboring states in Michigan and Minnesota. There, the flagship universities have their own governing boards. There's some constitutional authority. They're not part of a system that includes all the public universities in the state. In the case of, and obviously there's some tension between autonomy on the one hand and accountability on the other, right? When you're talking about a public institution like UW Madison. On the other hand, other states, so Michigan, for instance, tries to address that issue by making the governing bodies of its leading public research universities, which would be University of Michigan, Michigan State, Wayne State, accountable to voters through statewide elections for their boards. So when you think about that, when you think about how those universities work, when you compare them to Wisconsin with our tuition freeze, with things like we don't actually allow borrowing or construction management, sort of directly, project management directly through the universities or a higher education entity, the way many other states do.
So how does a building get constructed on a UW campus?
Well, we have something called the State Building Commission, which handles both borrowing and approving construction and renovation projects
for all government buildings.
Correct. I mean, they're approving the project, they're issuing the debt, that's going to finance it, and then the Department of Administration is also involved in managing those projects. In other states, there are higher education entities that do the financing and that manage the projects.
Jason, the study took a deep look at construction of projects on campus, and also it took a look at maintenance repair and a very large demand for maintenance and repair funds on UW campuses. Are our buildings getting too old?
I mean, I think that's infrastructure, both for the university and other areas of state and local government, has been a big concern of our organization. And I think sometimes, what gets the most attention in terms of financial difficulties are the things that show up clearly on a balance sheet. And sometimes these deferred maintenance issues can be something I think that gets neglected. The last estimate that we had is a few years old, but what it found, if you sort of extrapolate it out, is an overall deferred maintenance backlog within the UW system of about $2.9 billion and about $1.3 billion at UW Madison alone. And so, obviously, that's not something in the midst of a pandemic that you're going to necessarily be able to make a ton of progress on. But it's sitting there waiting for us when we come out the other end of this.
It's a very large liability to have out there.
It is. I mean, it's something, and it doesn't necessarily mean that every university building has got to be gold plated and has got to be top of the line. But the heating and cooling systems need to work. The roofs can't leak, for
right.
long anyway.
Right. And I know campuses like UW Madison have actually had to pull dollars out of their academic fund to patch a leaky roof, in this case in Bascom Hall.
Yeah.
Are we going to continue to see this if this problem's not adjusted?
Well, it's got to be addressed. And, one of the things with these capital issues is, sometimes failing to do maintenance that is required in the short term. You can save money today, but you end up having to pay more tomorrow. I mean, just think about it from the standpoint of a homeowner. If your roof needs to be replaced, you can go a year or two maybe without doing it, but if it starts to leak, then you have a problem that you wouldn't have had if you had repaired it. And that's why most people, they do that maintenance on their home if they're able to do it.
So what's the advantage for a campus to have its own building commission, to have its own bonding authority?
Sure. So, I mean, again, and some of it depends on what you have the ability to do. But again, the university itself, I think it certainly gets greater flexibility, greater autonomy, to go out to the markets when they want to do it, when it's advantageous for them to maybe structure the bonds in a way that's more advantageous for them, to approach the construction project. I'm not that's not the world that I live in, but obviously they have the ability to tailor what they're doing to their particular needs, whatever it happens to be. Now, a totally separate policy question that has sort of come up during the pandemic is this question of whether or not the university system should be able to issue or take on debt for operations.
Can other campuses do that around the country?
I mean, that is something that we did not look at that specific. It's certainly the case that most other higher education entities have an ability to borrow that Wisconsin does not. We did not look at that, at what you use that for. And obviously that is something to be cautious about, because if you borrow for your current operations, you're making your budget in future years more difficult, because you're going to have to pay off that debt. You're shifting that obligation into the future. But that's a request that's been made.
Where would a short-term line of credit be advantageous for UW then?
Well, again, I mean, this goes back to the reserves that we just talked about. I mean, every organization needs cash flow, and you can have it because you have the money on hand. You can have it because you borrow the money. But that's something that's come up for that reason.
So let's dive in. Everybody loves UW athletics. What would a short-term line of credit do for UW athletics?
Right, and again, that's not an area where I would present myself as any kind of an expert. Obviously, there are challenges that they face right now because all of their budget is built on Camp Randall being full. Their budget is built on the Kohl Center being full. Their budget is built on these games that are in many cases being postponed or canceled happening. And so this is an example of where you make a perfectly reasonable, rational budget based on a world where there's college football, happening in the normal way, and people buying brats at Camp Randall, and we don't live in that world right now.
So a short-term line of credit would help them bridge the gap between where we're at right now and the day when all those people can go back to Camp Randall and the Kohl Center. That's what you're saying?
I mean, that's the argument that's being made. And again, I want to emphasize that we are not advocating for or against that policy. We're simply just trying to provide information about it. And again, the trade-off is getting flexibility to manage your cash flow issues in this unprecedented pandemic, but also then the trade-off is you may push liabilities into the future. You may push some of your present financial difficulties into the future because you've taken on that additional debt.
I think maybe one of the only silver linings of COVID-19 is it provides a perfect example of why this short-term borrowing authority is essential here in Wisconsin and on our campuses.
Yeah, and it maybe underlines the need to have a discussion about, the good news is, I think, and we could talk about it, every time we get new details on how the state's finances are doing, they turn out to look better than I expected them to look. I mean, when April or May, things looked really dark and dire for the state. Since then, gradually, I think the picture has brightened a fair amount, and that's good news for taxpayers. It's good news for UW system, et cetera. But the bad news is that a lot of these structural issues that we're talking about, they were there before COVID-19, and they're going to be there afterward. And what we hope is that the urgency of this pandemic gets the state to have a conversation about how we start to address those things.
One of the challenges the Board of Regents faces, they're trying to be the governing body for such a diverse group, is that the individual campuses all have a different mission. Describe a little bit about how the flagship, how UW Madison's mission differs from the other campuses here in the state of Wisconsin, and why that matters in this conversation on structure and governance.
Think about it just from a practical standpoint of, like, you've just been named to the Board of Regents. Imagine you're on a board that just has one public university versus you're on a board that has 26 campuses. What is going to take you longer to get up to speed on? What is going to, and that's just the reality that our Board of Regents is called upon to just do a lot and know a lot and manage a lot. And so there are human limitations. So in terms of UW Madison, when you think about our peers among public research institutions, I mean, these are institutions like Michigan State, Ohio State, Purdue, the University of Texas at Austin, all the University of California schools, the UC Berkeley's and Davis's and San Diego's.
These are all campuses with large research budgets.
Exactly. And what are they trying to do there? I mean, they're not simply turning out the accountants and nurses and engineers of tomorrow, although that's a huge part of what they do. They're also doing very high-level research and development and innovation. And when you look at R&D spending, where UW Madison has fallen in the rankings over the past decade, from being third in the nation among public and privates to being number 8th. Our peers are not even just those public institutions. I mean, our UW Madison's peers are institutions like Harvard, And so I think one thing that it can be sort of difficult for your average person in Wisconsin is we just sort of, in some sense, hit the lottery historically, right? And got this university, and we sort of take it as a given that we have this flagship university that can compete on a research front with institutions like Harvard. But of course, it's not a given that we will always have that if we don't, continue to be thoughtful and I think judicious about how we handle higher education.
Jason, you've taken a very deep dive into a lot of subjects important to the UW. What's the most surprising thing that you found in your study?
I mean, I think the thing that jumped out at me was all these trends, the enrollment decline, the tuition freeze, the state funding lagging. We sort of knew all those things were out there for the university. It's not a surprise. What was surprising to me, though, was the degree to which we stood out as a state when we compare ourselves to, peer states and peer institutions around the country. It really was something that in case after case just jumped out at you. So, I mean, it's not one thing that I can point to, but it's sort of what the totality looks like when you try and put your arms around all of it. You think, wow, okay, we really have been on many of these things a little bit of an outlier.
Well, we're a very proud state. And I think that's something that would bother people if they were aware of.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, another way to think about it is that, there's also certain goals like holding down tuition where the people that advocated for that policy can in some ways declare victory.
They can.
They set out to hold down tuition. They did it. They set out to hold down tax funding. They did it. And our tax ranking as a state in terms of our tax burden as a share of personal income has dropped. I mean, we were, when I started sort of following state government, we were a top 10 taxing state. Now we're below the national average. We're 23rd. So, I mean, you can look at it different ways. If you're someone that had never wanted that to happen, you obviously look at it as a very negative trend. If you're someone that deliberately voted for those policies, you can again say, well, maybe in some sense mission accomplished. But the information is there for people to sort of, decide how they feel about it.
Right. All right, Jason, I have to put you on the spot now. I know you don't want to, you're not an advocate for any type of change.
Correct.
Yeah, your paper does kind of touch on a few policy options that you
absolutely.
that you discussed. You want to just spend a moment and go through what you found regarding state funding and what a policy option could potentially be for the state to consider?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think in the context of COVID-19, again, the state budget is really holding up better than we expected. But I mean, I think in this pandemic world, we're more in a stance of trying to avoid difficult budget cuts for higher education right now than we're in a reinvestment mode. But I think whatever happens to state funding, I think there ought to be a discussion about, okay, what do we have to do because of the state budget right now? But then what are we going to commit to doing in the future to try and at least over time provide adequate state funding for higher education? In the past, when there's been state funding cuts, there have tuition was allowed to increase. I mean, that's a double-edged sword for the families of the state that have to pay it, but that's, something to consider. There's a question of if there is an increase in tuition, or even if there isn't, is there going to be additional financial aid for the families that, are going to most struggle to pick up that burden? Because obviously the pandemic has affected people very unevenly. I mean, some people like myself, I can work from home. I'm doing relatively well. Other people,
not an option. Yeah,
that's not the world they're living in. And then, obviously, there's a number of things that we can look at in the realm of governance. Are there flexibilities that could be provided to the university that would help them manage their costs, or in some way better respond to the current situation? And then finally, also, our report does look at potential things that could be done in the realm of economizing or making cuts. We're not advocating directly for any of those, but we tried to provide a full slate of options to policymakers.
Let's say they ignore them all. What do you predict would be the future for higher education in the next couple of years?
I mean, I think one of the fallacies that sometimes happens in policymaking is we assume that doing nothing will lead to everything being the same.
They can't feel that way this year.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the sort of benefits, if you will, it's maybe the wrong word, of this pandemic, is that we realize that everything we do is going to reverberate. Look, I mean, I'll just say what the path that we have been on is that funding for higher education has dipped. Our standing, both in, I think, pretty objective metrics like R&D spending, but also less, maybe less objective ones like, your ranking, magazine rankings and such have dipped. You have seen, faculty numbers decline. You have seen, we have faculty salaries, particularly for full professors, have lagged, other institutions. It's hard to see how those trends turn around without, some kind of, without some kinds of improvements. And not all these things have to be zero sum. I mean, one area where it might be a win-win is we have many students of color right now are not accessing higher education at the same rates that white students are. And as our society, our student body that is graduating high school becomes more diverse, it becomes, I think, more and more important, not just from a social equity standpoint, but from just a basic standpoint of, will there be students in the classrooms in colleges and universities and people graduating with the kind of degrees we need? For a whole variety of reasons, we need to do better, as a society there. And that is one, I think, where it's less zero sum, right? Where we're taking from Peter and giving to Paul. That's more of a situation where everyone would really benefit from that happening. So, a lot of this has been doom and gloom, I suppose, but, it doesn't mean that there aren't some really positive steps that we could take as a state.
Jason, I think we should finish on that positive note. Thank you very much for your time. This is Matt Cuso, and you've been listening to The Flagship.